I've actually been working on a few projects, and this is just the one that came to fruition first. And these were a bunch of songs I'd written a few years ago, and I always wanted to do a record that was more atmospheric.
It certainly is.
Had one tone and atmosphere to it that just carried through. You know, those kind of records that you just put on and they have something almost comforting to them. You know, I guess it's a bit sad, but it also resonates. It's pretty colors. You know?
It's lush.
Yeah,
too,
yeah,
which
it's
is
lush,
great.
but it still has some grit to it. You know,
the lyrics on these songs seem more accessible than in a lot of your other work.
Sure. I wanted these songs to be more direct and, you know, not trying to reinvent something necessarily, just trying to write a good, simple song, something that could have been written 40 years ago or in 40 years. And, you know, that's a discipline. For me, I enjoy writing more abstract and using a lot of imagery and throwing in 5 different ideas at the same time. And this was more of a discipline kind of approach and also kind of harken back to some of the things I was doing when I was first starting out, more folk based and more traditional sounding.
But please don't ever stop doing the other thing of 5 ideas at one time.
Yeah,
because you really do that well.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, it's really extraordinary as a listener to get into that. There's always something new. There's always more to nourish you in that. And just to see how your mind works, it's fascinating. Right.
The way I try to operate is to set myself up for disaster, so to speak. You know, I like going on stage sometimes and not knowing what I'm going to do, or sitting down and starting to play a song that I don't even remember how it goes, but I'll just make it up if I have to. And you know, I feel like those are the points where you're not even sure you like what you're doing. You're following something. You get to something that's it's not that it's honest, it's just vulnerable. You know, you're gonna whatever professionalism you've built up or acquired is going to be set aside, and you know, you're going to stumble into something more genuine.
That's a huge risk to take on stage. I mean, you must have a lot of confidence that you're up to the test.
Well, I don't know what it is. I just it's kind of what I have to do, you know, just to get into it. Sometimes, in order to do something well, I have to do it bad first. You know, I have to write a bad song before I can feel like I can write a good one. And I just have to be okay with that, you know, and I kind of embrace it, you know.
But
I have to perform badly, or, you know, if people are dancing and there's a get together, sometimes I'll have to get up and dance as bad as and then I can get into it.
You were a guest DJ once on the World Cafe, and we found out about your love of folk music and blues and a very wide-ranging interest in music. Is there any kind of music you don't like or don't feel a kinship with?
There's music that I find curious, and I can usually find something to like about it. Like that music that when you go get a massage and they start playing
new agey stuff.
Yeah, I'm sort of fascinated by that music, but I've been fascinated by that music since I was a kid. But you know, I can find something in most music. I found when I was younger, I was more curious about the music, especially if I had some aversion to it. I was always wondering, well, why don't I like it? You know, usually what would happen is if I found out about it, or I got some idea of where they were coming from with the music, then my appreciation of it would increase, and, you know, it was easier for me to understand it.
What were you exposed to when you were growing up?
The typical kind of things, the Stones, Beatles. I think Blondie were big when I was younger. I guess I heard, you know, classic rock radio, and a lot of show tunes. I remember my mom really liked musicals.
When you layer all these different things together into a really dense mix, how do you know when it's finished?
Well, sometimes it just never is. I mean, I think at this point, with technology, you can remix a song, you can strip it away, you can make 40 different versions. I thought it would be interesting to make an album that was just one song. Every permutation of that song you could possibly do. We did a contest on my website a couple of years ago where I put up the basic parts of one of my songs and let anybody who wanted to remix it. And even with very crude computer programs that, you know, anybody can download for free on the internet, you know, I had dozens, probably hundreds of people send in remixes where they'd taken the pieces of the music and in the computer switched them around or added a bossa nova beat under it or did something really abrasive and electronic. And I just had a dozen or so CDs filled with all these versions of the song. And it was kind of endless.
Then what did you do with it?
I picked a couple that I thought were the best. Actually, what I did, and I lost all my notes, I actually listened to all of them. And I found almost every song had, 10 seconds to a minute that were amazing or that were really unique or had something. And I was going to take all these songs and take the little bits that were amazing and put them all together. So it would be this 10, 15-minute piece of music that would just... that would have been created by a couple of hundred people.
It's a great idea.
I know. I actually shouldn't be talking about it now because I want to make a record that way. And that's pretty much sums up my process. And I think, the same, that's kind of what the creative act is. I'll read an interview with a writer and they'll talk about the same thing. I was reading something recently. They said, well, how did you write this novel? He said, I just took the things that I liked about the things that I wanted to read in a novel, just wrote that, the things that I hadn't quite seen, I had seen bits of, but it wasn't fully realized as the way I wanted to see it.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, and I think that's why I got into making music, I think people are going to want to participate in that eventually.
Where do you find all the stuff you sample? I'm thinking of Swing Both Ways and Let's Make It Our Baby, for instance, and where it's at. Where do you find all that stuff?
I collect a lot of old vinyl, and that was something that the Dust Brothers had sitting around their house. They have, between them, probably a collection of about 30,000 records. So, that was just a record that got pulled off the shelf one day, and we listened to the whole thing, and picked a couple of lines that fit in here and there. But we did that record, that was about 7 years ago. That was right at the end when you could still sample things. And now to sample something, can cost you anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. I mean, that's an entire album budget. Just put one little bit of a sound. So it's become prohibitive to sample. And I think you can hear that in a lot of the urban music. It's people are using pre-programmed synthesizer boxes and sound boxes instead of sampling, and so that aspect, which I loved about hip hop production, because it was almost this John Cage idea of chance. You don't know how the sample's going to land and the rhythm of that sample, how it's going to go against the other things that are in it, and the quality of the people who had recorded that original sample, how it blends in with something that's coming 20, 30 years later. And I just thought it was such a beautiful friction and almost musical, chemical concoction. And I think that whole aspect's kind of died off at this point.
Where do you get your sense of humor?
I don't know. I was raised on, everything from Benny Hill and Jacques Tati to Felix the Cat and I don't know. I guess it comes from where you come from and the kind of things that you grew up with and the people you grew up with. You get bits and pieces of it here and there. But for me, the humor kind of it makes you human. It's kind of a sign of sanity, because you're able to sort of differentiate from the absurd and reality and play with them.